So Savant calls what he does complextro, which I think is a pretty apt description. But I want to listen to this one again. Sick, he's playing in Denver. What is what's the next one? I know it's Duke Deuce, but I don't remember the name of the track. Yeah. This also might get clipped by YouTube. this would go so crazy live. Yeah. I might have to, Crank That's not going to be anywhere close. But Nightmare might play it. Those drops are so good. Because you get that syncopated drop, so you get it offbeat a little bit. It's still predictable, but it's not as straightforward. Right, one of the big things for pop music that work in its favor is it is very predictable. And your brain rewards you when you are able to predict where the song is going to go. It also tends to be pretty easy to remember. So once you've heard it once or twice, you can, remember and predict where it's going to go after that. And so that it makes sense that is how it works. This is a little bit more interesting because it is still pretty predictable. They build the feeling of the drop. You know that the drop is going to hit. You know the bass or the synth is going to come in crazy. But the first few times you hear it, you're going to jump the gun a little bit, and then you're going to be surprised when it hits instead of timing it. And I think that's a good feeling. When the DJ, cause live you can extend this even farther to build the beat, and it's just it's a really interesting experience, and it's interesting psychologically. I don't know what it is, but the ability to build a frenzy with just anticipation. It's so interesting. You can really control a crowd. But then when it hits and everybody starts moving, it's such a cool thing to be a part of. This music is not for everybody, but I've seen Skrillex live, and the feeling in the crowd is indescribable if you haven't been in it. Okay. Okay, I think this is going to be fun. This is going to be an interesting one because, I'm not by any means an expert on Mormonism. I would not pretend to that. But my parents lived in Salt Lake City for a while, and both there and in Colorado when we lived here when I was a kid, we had a lot of Mormon friends. So I know a decent amount of things about Mormonism. I know probably some of the big gotchas for why Mormonism makes no sense. Also, I know about Joseph Smith from a different perspective. There's a book. I don't remember it might be Land. I don't remember which book it is. If it is Land, That's by Simon Winchester, but I don't think that's right. I just remember talking about the burned out district. And Joseph Smith's family came from a part of the country in New York that was like well known for religious revival and like sects. And his family, it must have been Krakatoa. I think that, which is also by Simon Winchester. But his family left New York because of the year without a summer. A lot of people thought either that the world was ending or just that you couldn't grow crops in New York anymore. So they sold their farms and they headed to like Ohio and the Midwest, right? The Western territories. And the rain did come again, but as a result of that, a lot of these religious fanatics, which for the 1800s is saying a lot, fanatical then looks different than it does today. And they left and headed west. And then Joseph Smith just kind of kept going. So like that's the background of where he comes from, is this community of very religious, like doomsday type people. Let's see if I can. Burned over district. That's my fault. So the burnt over district is parts of western and central New York state. Religious revivals and the formation of new religious movements of the Second Great Awakening took place to such a great extent that spiritual fervor expanded like a forest fire, according to probably this Whitney Cross. Charles Grandison Finney popularized the term. His posthumous autobiography referred to a burnt district to denote an area in central and western New York State during the Second Awakening. I found that region of country what, in the Western phrase, would be called a burnt district. There had been a few years previously a wild excitement passing through that region, which they called revival of religion, but which turned out to be spurious. It was reported as having been a very extravagant excitement, and resulted in a reaction so extensive and profound as to leave the impression on many minds that religion was a mere delusion. A great many men seemed to be settled in that conviction. Taking what they had seen as a specimen of a revival of religion, they felt justified in opposing anything looking toward the promoting of a revival. Okay, so basically they had this like really big and exciting period where people were like really fired up, and then nothing really happened. And so a lot of people thought, okay, this is not something worth paying attention to. Okay, Whitney R. Cross, blah, blah, blah. The Latter-day Saint movement originated circa 1828. Joseph Smith lived in the area and said he was led by the angel Moroni to his source, the Golden Plates, near Palmyra, New York. Right, the Millerites also came from that area. I knew that. I didn't want to say it, but I did remember that. The Fox sisters, that's pretty funny. The Shakers, for sure. And this is like early to late 1800s. I mean, this is a pretty long period of time that stuff is happening. But the year without a summer is 1816. Right? That's the year of Frankenstein. It is something I actually know a decent amount about because I read a ton about it. Volcanoes are a lot more impactful on climate than most people think, or no. And it's really fascinating to me. So I read a whole book about it. And now I know things. But we won't talk about that now.
The following is adapted from arguments I made in my recent debate on the Book of Mormon. In 1986, the Mormon president Ezra Taft Benson said the following: "Just as the arch crumbles if the keystone is removed, so does all the church stand or fall with the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon." So,
okay, I agree with that. I will come out and state my position that the Book of Mormon is not a real Bible, and it is a real religion, but the God they worship is no more real than other gods, and it was definitely made up by a guy. Like, he definitely made it up and was lying. So it's a real religion because the people who follow it really believe that it's divine. Okay, so I'm not saying they don't have genuine religious beliefs, but as far as like religion being a scam goes, that one is for sure a scam. But the people who are Mormons are often very nice, so it's not a terrible thing. But they also do believe some very insane things that most people don't know they believe, because it's not, they haven't read the Book of Mormon or listened to the people in the church.
here's 5 reasons to reject the Book of Mormon, which, as a result, become 5 reasons to reject the religion of Mormon.
Trent, why are you leaning in like this, bro? Your head looks enormous.
So, number 1, the evidence for the Book of Mormon is not impressive. I'm not Mormon for the same reason Mormons aren't Muslim. Many Muslims say the Quran must be divinely inspired because an illiterate shepherd like Muhammad could not have composed something so beautiful and complex.
Hey, I would say the same thing about Matthew, Mark, John. I am willing to concede that the person who wrote Luke probably was a Greek-speaking, Greek-writing person. But if you believe Matthew wrote Matthew, that's a tough hill to climb. So it's interesting how some of these arguments apply to Christianity as well when you step back and are not trying to point out the flaws in somebody else's religion. Right? Your religion doesn't make any sense because of X. And then I can step back and say, well, it seems like X applies to you as well. And you'd have to figure out how it doesn't.
Mormons reject that argument for Islam, then they should understand why I reject similar arguments that claim Joseph Smith could not have dictated the Book of Mormon to a scribe over a 70-day period. Milman Perry, one of the pioneers in studying oral traditions, showed that indigenous oral storytellers could recite epic poems of over 300,000 words in length in just a few weeks. So the Book of Mormon being recited in a few months is not impossible by human standards. Smith recited about 4,000 words per day to scribes who wrote at a speed of about 10 words per minute. That's plenty of time to give a recitation. And the Book of Mormon is filled with stock phrases like "behold" or "and it came to pass," as well as recycled story structures that help an oral presenter recite it.
Okay, so his argument is that it doesn't have to have been magical for him to have been able to produce that by speaking.
Joseph Smith was also a member
That's a terrible looking child.
of the Juvenile Debate Society, and school children at the time could memorize things like the entire Gospel of Matthew in just a few weeks, or they could give impromptu.
I grew up with people that did that. Like, I grew up with homeschoolers that memorized the Bible on that level.
Sermons that lasted for hours. Moreover, unlike Christ or the apostles, Joseph Smith and Muhammad performed no verifiable miracles to authenticate.
What verifiable miracles do you have about Jesus? Verifiable. Not in the Bible, it says he did it, but verifiable. Because I agree that you can't verify any of Joseph Smith's claims. But you also can't verify that Jesus walked on water. The Bible says that he does, and nobody else says that. So, how do you verify that? Because you cannot just, you cannot say, well, because of God, because that is also what a Muslim would say, and that's also what a Mormon would say. That's how it is, because God did it that way. And that's the truth, that's the verification that I need, is that God did it. And the Bible says so, or the Quran says so, or the Book of Mormon says so. Or the, I don't know, X other religious text. It just isn't enough to do that.
Indicate their status as prophets. All we have is a book that apparently no human being can create. The only thing that seems supernatural in the case of Mormonism are the three witnesses claiming to have seen an angel with Joseph Smith. Now, this could have been a demonic encounter.
Or they could have been lying. They could have just been making it up. Joseph Smith could have said, hey guys, here's what happened. I'm the best speaker. I have the inspiration. You guys back me up. I mean, that could equally have happened.
Paul even warns in Galatians 1 to reject angels who preach false gospels. But it could also be the product of excitable people prone to see visions around every corner. Consider the three witnesses of this alleged event. First, there's David Whitmer, who said the angel had no appearance or shape, but that it was an impression he felt. He later left the Mormon church, saying, God spake to me again by his own voice from the heavens, and told me to separate myself from among the Latter-day Saints. Second, there's Oliver Cowdery, who also left the church before briefly rejoining for a few months before his death. Cowdery claimed to see visions before he met Joseph Smith. He knew Smith for years before he became one of Smith's scribes, and Cowdery believed that dowsing rods could speak to him. Third, there's Martin Harris, who mortgaged his farm to fund the publishing of the Book of Mormon, which means Harris had a huge financial motivation to convince people of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon. And multiple sources describe Harris as someone who is easily spooked, like seeing the devil in candlelight flickers. In 1842, John Clark said of him, Harris was ready to be duped by anything. No matter where he went, he saw visions and supernatural appearances around him. Once while traveling, quote, he met the Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah, this dude sounds crazy.
Who walked by the side of him in the shape of...
But also, how can you fucking prove that he didn't do that? How can you prove that that didn't happen? This dude is crazy. But if Jesus is real, he appeared to Paul. He made Paul blind for 3 days. So why couldn't somebody appear? Jesus appeared to those guys on the road to Emmaus, and they didn't recognize him. And then they realized later that it had been Jesus, right? How is that different than this guy believing that the deer is speaking to him? It could be God. That doesn't make sense why that's how he would have done it, but it could have been. That's totally plausible if God is real in the way that Christians believe God is real.
The deer for 2 or 3 miles, talking with him as familiarly as one man talks with another. Harris also admitted that he saw the golden plates, from which the Book of Mormon was allegedly translated, with spiritual eyes, causing some people to leave the Mormon church as a result. Harris also left Mormonism, calling them Latter-day Devils. Finally, there's no conclusive
Well, he called them that, saying he and a few others are the only true Mormons left. So those people have become heretical. Mormonism is true, but the people that are currently in charge of it are not. Right? That's what he's saying.
Record of all 3 men seeing an angel at once. This is not a case of a group hallucination. It's a case of a group of people being brought into the wilderness, primed by Joseph Smith to see an angel, and after praying ecstatically for hours, they finally saw it in their own mind's eye. And the alleged golden plates themselves could have been natural.
I don't even know if that is true. Why would it... That it doesn't have to be true. That story could all be bullshit. It's interesting. Maybe he is like Steel Manning, right? Maybe he is trying to take a generous interpretation of the possibility of the story being true. And he's trying to like explain it with rational explanations as opposed to saying, I mean, it seems made up. It seems like this guy and some of his friends and a guy who stood to make money on this got together and made a plan. That's what it sounds like.
Artifacts are simply frauds. In 1843, brass plates were unearthed in Kinderhook, Illinois, and Joseph Smith claimed they referred to an Egyptian descendant of Ham. But the plates were created by a blacksmith as a hoax. In 1845, James Strang, an early LDS dissenter, claimed to have translated metal plates describing ancient peoples. But unlike Joseph Smith's golden plates, non-Mormons confirmed the existence of the Strang plates. Martin Harris, one of the original Book of Mormon witnesses, even became one of Strang's followers for a brief period. Mormons don't believe in James Strang's plates or the Kinderhook plates, and I don't believe in Joseph Smith's plates. Number 2, Book of
Same. I also don't believe in any of those things.
Mormon geography is abysmal. Many Bibles contain maps that describe where biblical events took place. If you get Jewish, Christian, and atheistic scholars together in a room, they would agree on these maps, even though they disagree about what exactly happened at the sites in the maps. But you cannot do that for the Book of Mormon. In spite of all its geographical references, Mormons only know the events in the Book of Mormon took place somewhere in North and South America. Some Mormons say they took place in Central America. Others say as far away as the Great Lakes or the American Heartland. That would be like Christians disagreeing on whether Jesus was crucified in Judea or England. And
it would also maybe be like believing that there was a flood that covered the entire earth and killed all of the pre-existing humans, except for one family. That also sounds sort of overbroad.
Silence in the archaeological record is deafening. For example, one of the largest cities in ancient America, Cahokia, had about 20,000 people spread out over 100 earthwork settlements. But Zarahemla, a city in the Book of Mormon that had at least 100,000 people in it, has never been found.
Damn. Now, here's the thing. That obviously that's true, that there is no such city. But what we are learning through LiDAR scanning of forests is that there seem to be more megacities than we thought in Mesoamerica. Like, huge megacities. This actually was really interesting to me. So I want to see if I can find I'm going to see if I can find some articles. I'll start with this one, see if I can actually read it. I'm not sure it's going to let me read it. But, okay, so this looks like maybe a high school, maybe a middle school thing. Okay, so, major discovery in Maya archaeology: houses, palaces, highways, and other human-made features hidden for centuries in the jungles of northern Guatemala. LiDAR, which is in many iPhones now, was used. Light detection and ranging. It's different than radar because it shoots lasers. It can create a very accurate map of where the light stops to reflect, right? If it hits a leaf, if it hits a branch, if it hits a twig, if it hits part of a wall, or if it hits the ground, you get a sort of 3D map of based to the floor of the jungle, which you could not do with radar. would be far too noisy, and it doesn't get through the leaves to get to the ground. So LiDAR is amazing. And what it is discovering is the more we are scanning these sites and what's around these sites, we're finding connections between formerly unconnected sites. Right? So, like, you thought you had two different settlements, but what you actually have is an extension of one settlement connected by a highway of some sort. Previous studies had compared the Maya civilization to scattered city-states. Current research indicates they could be compared to sophisticated cultures like those in ancient Greece or China. Highways connecting city and mining quarries, complex irrigation. Interurban connectivity. Data supports the idea that there were 10 to 15 million people in areas controlled by the Maya. So this is really interesting. I think this is such a cool technology that we can use and really get some, because it's so hard to find stuff in the jungle, in a tropical jungle, right? It's muddy and humid. The desert is great because stuff's preserved forever because it's hot and dry and there's no rain to ruin it. In the forest, in the jungle, it's not like that. And if you're building stuff with wood, it rots. And then you got nothing left. So it's just harder. But with LiDAR, they're able to find the outline of stuff, right? They can kind of find, this is a hill that it seems like there is a reason it's here, as opposed to it's just a random hill in the jungle. And I think that's super cool.
I haven't even found a single example of Hebrew or Egyptian that should be in the New World if the Book of Mormon is correct that Native Americans are the ancestors of Jews who emigrated in the 7th century BC from...
Yeah, that's a crazy thing to believe. It makes no sense. It is extremely crazy to believe that.
Israel.
Also, it's white supremacist.
To America. In fact, Mormons can't even agree on which rivers or mountains are described in the Book of Mormon. Fletcher B. Hammond, in his book, Geography of the Book of Mormon, actually claimed that God changed the world's topography after the Book of Mormon events took place so that faith would be required to believe in the Book of Mormon. How convenient. Plus, the Book of Mormon...
You might say the same thing about the Bible. About some of the things that I have brought up about the Bible on my streams. You could say that they are also asking big questions.
Contains things we know did not exist in ancient America. For example, it describes horses and chariots, even though there were no chariots, and horses were introduced after Columbus arrived in the New World. Now, some more...
That's true. There were no horses on North America natively.
Mormons say the word horses refers to tapirs, which are kind of like big, weird-looking pigs. And chariots were actually litters carried by other humans.
Why would it be tapirs? You had just tapirs hauling people all around. It's like dewbacks in Star Wars.
But then, why are the horses in the Book of Mormon always mentioned with these chariots, as if they pulled them? But they couldn't have, because who would want an overgrown pig pulling these kinds of chariots? Or why would you...
Hey, rude. I think it would be charming. I don't know how well it would work, but I think that those tapirs are cute with their long noses, and I would be happy to be pulled along by a tapir, if that were available to me.
Want them around human litters in the first place. It's no wonder the National Geographic Society has said archaeologists and other scholars have long probed the hemisphere's past, and the Society does not know of anything found so far that has substantiated the Book of Mormon. And while not every biblical event has archaeological confirmation,
That's crazy that the National Geographic Society has issued a ruling.
this is far different than an alleged entire ancient history having zero archaeological evidence for it. Number 3, Joseph Smith was a false prophet. The book of
Damn,
Deuteronomy
right to the
says
heart.
a false prophet leads people away from the true God and fails to predict the future. Joseph Smith was guilty on both of these counts. So we should not believe that God used a false prophet like him to transmit inspired revelation. In his History of the Church, Joseph Smith prophesied that Jesus Christ would return sometime in the 19th century, and that the government of the United States would be overthrown, both of which, of course, didn't happen.
Right. Remember what we were talking about with these burned over districts, these apocalyptic, what's the word? Ecstatic cults. Right? There were multiple representations of that here. LDS, the Millerites, and the Great Disappointment, which then became Seventh-day Adventists. The Shakers, the Oneida Society, right? Like, these people, they thought the world was going to end. A lot of them did. Maybe not all of them did. Joseph Smith did.
I'd like to say Joseph Smith predicted the Civil War 30 years before it happened, but anyone at the time knew there were troubles between the North and the South. Smith also predicted that, quote, war will be poured out upon all nations, beginning at this place. But no other nations fought in the American Civil War, which shows this was a false prophecy.
Well, maybe it means that other nations were also at war at the same time, because that was certainly true. I don't know that. Like, I'm not really even being that generous to say I don't know if I would interpret that as he meant that they would fight in our Civil War.
And Smith definitely led people away to believe in false gods. At the funeral for Elder King Follett, Joseph Smith said, God himself was once as we are now, and is an exalted man, and sits enthroned in yonder heavens. According to the Book of Abraham,
True.
which Smith also allegedly translated, God is a superpowered man who rules near a star or planet named Kobach. If Mormons are faithful enough, they too can become gods and rule over their own universes alongside the spouses they marry in this life.
It's a pretty sweet deal, you know. That's a cool version of heaven. You get to become God.
But this contradicts the central truth about God. The Creator is not and never has been a creature. The omnipotent God can become man, or assume a human nature, along with his divine nature.
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing about Zeus, for example.
But man cannot become God. The fact that Smith taught the contrary means he is a false prophet. And speaking of the Book of Abraham, Smith claimed he translated an ancient papyrus written in Abraham's own hand that talks about the gods creating the world. But even Mormon Egyptologists agree that the papyrus was simply a collection of 2nd century Egyptian funerary texts, and they say nothing about Abraham.
Fake translator. I have a source text that nobody knows how to read. I'm trying to think. That was 1830 something. When was the Rosetta Stone? The Rosetta Stone was found about 40 years prior. So, I guess Egyptian was known, and some people were able to read some of it by like the 1820s, 1830s. But you would be safe in assuming that nobody that you would ever be talking to would be able to read what you are writing, right? Nobody in your world is ever going to know how to read Egyptian. So that's a pretty good script to use to make it say whatever you want it to say, because nobody else is going to know. That would be like me watching a movie with like Korean subtitles and subtitling it in English myself. Right, and just making the people say what I want them to say, like most extreme elimination challenge or whatever.
Certainly weren't written by him. Now, some Mormon apologists say Joseph Smith was just using the papyri to help him write down visions he had. But in his own diary, Joseph Smith claimed to have translated that document. He even wrote an Egyptian alphabet and grammar to help him translate, even though he wasn't actually doing that, now that we check the original papyrus. But it's not only the Book of Abraham that reveals Joseph Smith was a false prophet.
Also, it's crazy to believe that you have an original text written in the hand of Abraham from several thousand years.
This is a model of the golden plates, 2/3 of which were sealed and allegedly couldn't be opened. That means there were at most 40 plates, each 6 by 8 inches, that were supposed to have contained information present in the 270,000 English words of the Book of Mormon. In order to contain that information, every character on one of these plates would have to represent 80 words.
Maybe it does. It's magic. Supernatural. How can you pick this apart? Jesus raised himself from the dead. God raised him from the dead. But the apostles raised people from the dead. Jesus raised people from the dead. The prophets raised people. Like, a lot of people have come back from the dead. So why can't one of these be 80 words if God is explaining it to you? And this is the symbol that represents this chapter. Yes, it's very efficient, if it is possible. Each picture is a meme, and you just have to translate it.
But ancient hieroglyphics don't work like that. Actual ancient metal plates, like the plates of Darius, only contain about 200 words per page. Smith's claim that the reformed Egyptian writing on these golden plates was simply part of his own imagination. In 1828, Martin Harris offered to assist Smith in the translation of the plates, but Harris lost 116 pages of the translated manuscript that Smith gave him. Smith claimed that God was angry at the loss of the pages and would only allow Smith to translate from another set of plates. These plates told the same story as the original manuscripts, but from a slightly different perspective. Of course, if Smith were just dictating the story from memory and not actually translating it, it would have been nearly impossible for him to reproduce what he originally dictated to Harris and prove he was not a prophet. Smith even describes in his book Doctrine and Covenants how his critics would have used the loss of the pages to try and prove that he was not miraculously translating the golden plates, and so he was not a prophet. Finally, Smith did what many false prophets have done throughout history. He used his status to acquire power, such as by becoming a town mayor, running for president of the United States, and acquiring multiple wives for himself, some as young as 14 years old.
How old was Mary? How old was Mary, the mother of Christ? I'm opposed to that, but again, this is taking one step back and asking questions about your own assumptions. My assumptions are based in fact because the God that I believe in is true, but the God that this guy believes in is not true. And I know that because some of the stuff he believes is unprovable or seems motivated by human things, and it's not done by God, and you can't prove it. But you can prove that the miracles happened because God says they did, and God is my God, right? Like, you are starting from the assumption that you are both right about the supernatural being real. But their version of it is wrong.
Smith lied to his wife about two of them, sisters Emily and Eliza Partridge, and one Mormon apologist admits, it is certainly true that Joseph did not disclose all of his plural marriages precisely when they happened. That's one way to put it. Smith also ordered a printing press to be destroyed for publishing
Yeah, that is definitely massaging the details.
works that were critical of him. He was later arrested in connection to this act and died in a shootout using a gun smuggled into the jail where he was being held. Joseph Smith was not a true prophet who died a martyr's death. He was a false prophet who met the ignoble end of so many other false prophets throughout history. Number 4, the Book of Mormon's very human elements. The Book of Mormon is good and original. However, the good parts aren't original, and the original parts aren't good.
Oh,
When it
damn,
comes
he
to the
got him
actual
with that A
original
is B,
parts of the
but
Book
B
of
is not
Mormon,
A.
they lack a divine quality. While many non-Christians are familiar with eloquent biblical stories like the parable of the prodigal son or the Sermon on the Mount, non-Mormons are unaware of anything as eloquent in the Book of Mormon. Far from being divinely inspired, the book is barely inspired by human standards. For example, Mark Twain thought the Bible was false, but he also admitted the Bible had noble poetry in it and some clever fables. When
True.
it comes to the Book of Mormon, Mark Twain said the following: "It is chloroform in print. If Joseph Smith composed this book, the act was a miracle, keeping awake while he did. Whenever he found his speech growing too modern, which is about every sentence or two, he ladled in a few such scriptural phrases as exceeding sore and it came to pass, which was his pet phrase. If he had left that out, his Bible would have been only a pamphlet. Indeed,
Thank
the
God his
entire
ass,
Mormon
Mark
feels like a
Twain.
mediocre novel delivered by a sermon that's gone on far too long, as can be seen in over 1,500 uses of the phrase, and it came to pass, which helped break up the narrative for someone orally presenting it. Smith's presentation was also aided by ripping off hundreds of New Testament themes and imagery that he repackaged for characters in the story. Or in 1 out of 7 verses, he simply outright copied the King James Bible, including its grammatical errors. There are entire chapters of the book of Isaiah in the text, though that could be explained by the ancient authors of the Book of Mormon regurgitating their alleged Israelite history. But that does not explain copies of the New Testament in the Book of Mormon they would not have known about. For example, Moroni chapter 10 in the Book of Mormon directly copies 1 Corinthians chapter 12's list of spiritual gifts: wisdom, knowledge, faith, healing, miracles, prophecy, and discernment of spirits, all in that order. But Moroni, allegedly living in the 4th century America, would have only known the Old Testament of his alleged ancestors. He could not have known about the first letter to the Corinthians. That's why, in his defense of the Book of Mormon, Robert Bennett says that Joseph Smith, quote, inadvertently slipped into language with which he was familiar, which we'd expect from a good storyteller. In fact, Joseph Smith's own mother said the following about him: "During our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of travel, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly, as if he had spent his whole life with them." Finally, there's the troubling fact that the basic story of the Book of Mormon, that Native Americans were the descendants of Jews who emigrated to America in 600 BC. That view had already been published a few years earlier in a book called View of the Hebrews, written by Ethan Smith. Fawn Brody, the author of the first scholarly biography of Joseph Smith, said, "The striking parallelisms between the two books hardly leave a case for mere coincidence." Indeed, this idea about Native Americans being the descendants of Jews was a common one in the 19th century, so it fits within the claim that a human author concocted the story of the Book of Mormon, especially since the science of genetics proves Native Americans are not descendants of Jewish migrants, which disproves Joseph Smith's claim that, quote, "our western tribes of Indians are descendants from that Joseph which was sold into Egypt." Some Mormon apologists claim that the people in the Book of Mormon went extinct and did not leave a DNA record, or didn't leave enough of it because there were already people living in the New World that swamped their DNA references. But the Book of Mormon never mentions other people living in the New World besides the books of Nephites and Lamanites, the latter of which went on to become Native Americans.
Damn. Trent's getting their asses with some kind of meaningless points that are accurate, but not really taking into the big picture of things.
These apologists just say that other peoples must have existed at that time because of the, quote, unbelievably high population growth rate in the Book of Mormon narrative. But this can be more easily explained by the Book of Mormon being a fictional narrative.
Interestingly enough, that article I was reading from National Geographic kind of supports the Book of Mormon more than it detracts from it. Obviously, there is no reason to believe that the Book of Mormon is correct or that Joseph Smith knew anything. But it does support the idea that you could have had these massive cities of, I think maybe they think 50,000, probably not 100,000. But it depends on how How connected is it if to be one city, and how connected is it to be two cities that are connected by a highway, right? Like that's kind of a decision you have to make. How far away does it have to be before you decide it's not part of the mega city structure?
Number 5, Catholicism is true, so the Book of Mormon.
Oh, damn. You're going to have to prove that one. Again, this is a pretty big assertion. Why is Catholicism wrong? Because Protestantism is true. So the Book of Mormon is false, and so is Catholicism. Why is the Book of Mormon right? Because Catholicism is false. Why is Islam correct? Because the Quran is correct, and therefore Christianity is false. I mean, it's not that difficult to reach that conclusion.
Is false. The Second Vatican Council taught that the Christian dispensation, therefore, as the new and definitive covenant, will never pass away, and we now await no further new public revelation before the glorious manifestation of our Lord Jesus Christ.
No more prophecy. No more prophets. No more changing. We're settled on a belief at this point, and we're not going to add anything new to the Bible.
Mormons and Catholics agree that Jesus established a hierarchical, visible church led by successors of the apostles who possessed the priesthood. We just disagree with the Mormon claim that this church left the earth for 1,700 years until Joseph Smith allegedly restored it in the 19th century. After all, Jesus said the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. Moreover, this church gave us sure knowledge of the very canon of Scripture found in the King James Bible that Mormons rely on as a sacred text. But the church that gave us the Bible authoritatively teaches that there has been no new public revelation since the time of the apostles, which includes the Book of Mormon.
And we know that they're correct to teach that.
Catholicism is true, and the Book of Mormon is not divinely inspired.
We know that they're correct to teach that. Because why? Because we believe that that is correct. But it doesn't have to be. You just believe that.
Inspired. Catholicism is true. Therefore, the Book of Mormon is not divinely inspired.
Okay, you have not proven that Catholicism is true. You have said that it is true multiple times. And you have said that the church fathers said no more prophecy, no more additions. We have fixed the text as it needs to be. But you have not proved that Catholicism is true in any way. You have just asserted it.
And even if you aren't Catholic,
I understand he believes that, and most of his audience believes that. But he has in no way refuted the idea that Catholicism could be false.
the fact that Mormons cannot agree on where the events in the Book of Mormon allegedly took place, Joseph Smith was in error when he tried to divinely translate or prophesy, and he was a false prophet, and the Book of Mormon contains obvious
Or just a liar. He was just a liar.
plagiarisms and anachronisms.
He's a con man.
Things that shouldn't belong in the book because they were written elsewhere, or things that shouldn't belong in it because they weren't a part of the ancient history the Book of Mormon purports to describe. All of these show the Book of Mormon was merely the product of human beings and is not a divinely inspired text. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to go deeper on this subject, be sure to check out the debate that I recently had, as well as my booklet, 20 Answers for Mormonism.
I do not want to do that. And also, I am in full agreement with Trent that Catholicism is more grounded in something than Mormonism is. But I do not agree that it is more true than Mormonism. There's more historical facts contained in their reference book. Right? Like, I will agree with that. But it doesn't mean that it's true just because some of the claims are verifiable with, like, archaeological data. There was a city here. See? Proof. The Bible is true because it says there's a city called Jericho, and look, there's one. It says there was a city in this part of the desert, and look, there's one. And that is cool. You have been able to discover stuff based on what the Bible says. That's true, which is kind of nice, right? It gives you a a record of some cities that maybe aren't mentioned elsewhere because they weren't that significant, or they only existed for a short period of time and word didn't get around. So that's kind of cool, but that doesn't mean it's supernatural. It just means that the people who were writing it down knew about the cities in the area of the world that they lived in. It has to be supernatural, right? But so much of this stuff is easily explainable without supernatural reasons. I am totally willing to believe that a scribe would know about a settlement, 10 miles away, or a people group that they were at war with constantly. I totally agree that those are real historical things. And it makes sense that they could be accurate with those. But that's not really the same as there was a flood that killed everybody because demons were fucking women and having children. And then interestingly, the descendants of the Anakim show up after the flood, which is, I need somebody to explain that to me. That's difficult if you think the flood really happened. But anyway, I'm done with Trent for today. Probably one more day this week, and then nothing for the weekend.